Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Art of Being a Woman. I'm your host, Courtney, and today we are discussing the art of setting boundaries that last. This topic is perfect, in my opinion, for this week because it's almost a continuation of last week's topic of overcoming people pleasing. Last week, we discussed how to become more comfortable with saying no and being more accepting of others being disappointed with us, regardless of the discomfort that brings. Because it is uncomfortable to feel as if you're doing something wrong or as if you're a bad person in someone else's eyes when you're truly just trying to look out for yourself and you're taking more responsibility for your happiness. Part of being able to really overcome people pleasing is being able to set boundaries. And not only setting the boundaries, we have to be able to protect them so that they last and they almost do the work we need it to do on its own. Because in the beginning, when we do set a new boundary in a relationship or even with ourselves, it's always the hardest because it's unfamiliar and we're used to really not having restrictions and limitations. But as we practice being more firm in the boundaries that we set, it becomes something that we have to think about less because we already set a limit for ourselves in advance. So we're going to get into 4 steps, as always, that will really go more in depth into how we can truly start setting boundaries that last in our relationships and honestly beyond our relationships. It'll become a new standard for living, and in future relationships that we start, we already have these systems in place. The 4 steps that I'm covering are from my Instagram and my Threads account at She Is Artfully Woman. If you are not following me there, I would love for you to join me. I post on Threads every single day, and I post on Instagram once a week. And everything I post is all related to the topics that I discuss here on the podcast. So if you enjoy these types of conversations, I'm sure you will enjoy connecting on Threads and Instagram as well. Now, the 4 steps are as follows. Step 1, consider what boundaries actually protect. Step 2, acknowledge the relationships where you have no limits. Step 3, protect your boundary when others push back. And 4, hold yourself to the same standards you set for others. Let's get straight into step 1. Consider what boundaries actually protect. Before I ever started setting clear boundaries in my life with myself and in my relationships with other people, I was honestly not 100% sure if boundaries were a good thing. And I also wasn't sure if they were necessary in every single type of relationship. It wasn't until I started reading this book that I actually bought for myself and completely forgot about it for months. It's called Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. I honestly didn't know what to expect when I started reading it, but surprisingly, I remember I was hooked instantly because it was just a very clear, logical explanation as to what boundaries are, why they're necessary in every relationship, and it really dove into every single type of relationship dynamic. It went into romantic relationships, it went into friendships, it went into family, and it went into the relationship that we have with ourselves. On top of that, it gave very good examples that many people can relate to. And I ended up finishing the book really understanding that as difficult as it may be to set boundaries in certain relationships, it's necessary for the success of the relationships that we're in, and it's also necessary for our own happiness and our own well-being, because when we are constantly ignoring our limits and we're pushing past what we know is our responsibility, it creates resentment, which is something that we discussed in last week's episode, The Art of Overcoming People Pleasing. The way that this book simply described boundaries was as follows. They described ourselves as a house, and around our house is a fence. Because most people, when they have a house, they have a fence around it to protect it from intruders, from stray animals, let's say. And we know because of the fence that whatever is inside the fence is our responsibility to take care of and maintain, and anything outside of the fence is not our responsibility, and it's not meant for us to be concerned with and maintain. Now, the same way that we would put a fence around a house to protect it and keep the good in and the bad out, the same thing goes for ourselves. We need to create a fence around ourselves that keeps the good in and the bad out. That doesn't mean that people are bad or good, but it's our responsibility to be aware of when we are allowing something in our lives to enter our personal space and it's hurting us, because that's a sign that our fence, quote unquote, has been breached and our boundaries are not as strong as we need them to be. And that takes practice. It takes going through situations in life where we don't really have strong boundaries and we don't know when to say no to other people. And through that discomfort that we feel and resentment, we begin to realize that something's not right and something needs to change. And if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure you know that we can't change other people. And waiting for someone else to change means we can be waiting forever. So our best bet in life is to work on changing ourselves and changing the way that we respond to situations so that we can get a better outcome and just be happier overall. And boundaries really helps us do that, especially in situations where we are building resentment and we just feel like there's no end to how much is expected of us. And in situations where we feel like it's really hard to say no. So in order to really start reviewing the relationships in our lives and deciding which ones need boundaries, we need to really see boundaries in the right light. We need to see boundaries for what they truly are. And the very simple answer is it's protection. It's protection for ourselves. And sometimes that just gets lost in translation, especially in those relationships where we don't really have those limits. Step 2, acknowledge the relationships where you have no limits. Many times, it's not that we have a hard time setting boundaries in all of our relationships, although that is possible, but it's usually in specific areas of our life. Perhaps we have really good boundaries with a romantic partner, but we have a hard time setting boundaries at work. And when our boss asks us to stay late and to just take on more responsibilities because they're overwhelmed, we do it even though deep down we don't really want to. It's almost something we don't think about. We don't really consider that we can say no in that dynamic. Or perhaps at work we have great boundaries and we don't stay late and we don't take on more work. But when it comes to our friendships, we have a hard time setting boundaries with them. Perhaps we constantly make ourselves available for them, even though we have other things we need to do for ourselves. And it's hard for us to say no to them because we care for them and we love them. We all have those areas of life where setting boundaries is a little trickier. So in order to really start setting boundaries that last, we really have to focus on those specific relationships that are the hardest, because that's where our real boundary work lies. Not in the relationships where it's easy, in the relationships where it's hard. Me personally, I would say I have always had pretty good boundaries at work. I never really cared too much if I was the best employee or loved the most by my boss. So I never really cared to stay overtime and take on more responsibility if I knew it wasn't a part of my job. But when it comes to family, honestly, I always would have a very hard time saying no because it's just not something that seemed like an option. And I never really knew why it didn't seem like an option. I just internalized that. And it wasn't until I started realizing in certain family relationships that I was building resentment and I did start setting some boundaries, I was getting pushback. I was getting resistance because I had never set boundaries in those areas of my life. And it was very uncomfortable. Not only was it uncomfortable, it was a little scary, I'll be honest, because it felt as if I could lose certain relationships in my life because of the boundaries I was setting. But it was only through those experiences of me doubling down on my boundaries in those relationships that my ability to set boundaries overall strengthened. And it made setting boundaries overall a lot easier. Because if I can handle the discomfort that I've experienced from setting boundaries in the relationships that used to intimidate me the most, then I can do it with anyone. I just want to be really clear that just because we realize that we have no limits in certain relationships, it doesn't mean that the whole relationship is trash and that we need to throw it out. Obviously not. What it does mean, though, is that we haven't really stood up for ourselves in a very long time in these dynamics. And that's not the other person's fault. Many times, if people are constantly offering their attention to us, their time, their effort, whatever it may be, if people are constantly giving it to us, we're not necessarily going to turn it down. And on top of that, when we do get used to someone always being so available for us, it's going to feel weird when that person decides they no longer want to give us as much access as we're used to. So when we do start to set boundaries in these relationships specifically, it really gives the other person an opportunity to decide, do they still want to participate in this relationship and respect the boundaries that we're setting with them? Or do they want to leave? Ultimately, it is their choice to make. I will say that through my experience, I have learned to give these relationships time, because if we have been a people pleaser for years, or we have just been overextending ourselves for years, and then out of nowhere, we have more of a backbone and we start standing up for ourselves, I think it does feel like a big shock to the other person, and it does feel personal, like I mentioned earlier. But ultimately, I do think that people adjust, especially if the relationship is valuable to the other person. They will adjust. Many times we avoid setting boundaries and having limits with certain people because we are scared that if we do tell a person no, or we do set firm boundaries, they won't want to be in relationships with us anymore, or they won't want to keep the relationship alive anymore. But if that's really the case, then that just isn't the right relationship for us. We deserve to be in relationships where our boundaries are respected, because the people that we're in relationships with respect us. So my advice is to start setting boundaries in the relationships where you realize you kind of have none, so that going forward, all the other boundaries will be a lot easier to uphold. Step 3, protect your boundary when others push back. This is inevitable. Whenever we are setting a new boundary, we are going to experience pushback from the other person. And this is where setting boundaries kind of becomes a two-step process. It's one thing to set boundaries, which is to draw that line and determine what our limit is. But then there's a deeper layer to it, and that's protecting our boundaries when someone is trying to overstep that line that we created. It is our responsibility to protect that line, protect that boundary we created for ourselves, because honestly, no one else is going to do it for us, and it's not their responsibility to do it for us. This means regardless if someone is trying to guilt trip us, regardless if someone is going to be angry, disappointed, give us the silent treatment, and potentially end the relationship because of a boundary we set, we still need to protect that boundary. That is our priority. Relationships come and go. If worst case scenario, we protect our boundary and that ends a big relationship in our life, we are truly protecting ourselves from harm, because someone that does not respect our boundaries does not respect us at all. It can be quite dangerous to be with someone that doesn't respect our no, especially as a woman. It's not easy to do, and there will be a period of time where you might feel as if you made the wrong choice, or perhaps your boundary was too harsh. But I promise the discomfort that we feel in that moment where there's tension because we drew a line that was never drawn before, that is the breakthrough moment in the relationship. And that's the breakthrough moment with setting boundaries. We are stepping into new territory. We are stepping into a version of ourselves that has more self-respect for ourselves. And we're also stepping into a version of ourselves that doesn't need anyone to agree with us on whether or not we deserve that amount of respect. We've just decided. And that's ultimately how it works. When you have a fence around your house and it's your house, you decide what's allowed to come into that house and onto your lawn. No one else decides that for you. And if anyone has a problem with it, they can step out, they can leave. In order for people to respect the boundaries that we set, we have to really prove to ourselves and to other people that the boundaries that we set matter. And we can only do that by being strict about them and not making exceptions for anyone, ourselves included. We cannot make exceptions for people we have a soft spot for, and we cannot make exceptions just because we're having a great day. Because ultimately, when we do keep these promises to ourselves consistently, we make it very known what we will and will not accept from other people. And by doing that, people learn to either respect it or leave. This is ultimately how we take control of our own lives. Because as I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, we can't control what other people do. We can only control what we do. So by setting the tone and giving a clear choice, respect boundaries or don't, but then you have to leave, our power goes back into our hands. Step 4, hold yourself to the same standards you set for others. This is like a call out step, but it's so necessary. And honestly, once you start getting in the habit of setting boundaries, you are going to learn to love this step, because setting boundaries is honestly a form of self-love. It's not just about self-respect, especially when it comes to setting boundaries with ourselves. We set boundaries with ourselves by monitoring what we let into our body, what we let into our mind, and emotionally, what we entertain. So if we know that we eat an unhealthy amount of candy, then it is our responsibility to set a boundary with ourselves on candy. And that boundary can look like you don't buy candy for your house. Or perhaps you love to drink when you go out. Drinking, we know, causes harm to the physical body, although it is enjoyable to have a drink. So set a boundary with yourself. Perhaps when you go out, you have a drink limit and you stick to it. You hold yourself accountable because it is your responsibility to protect yourself from harm. And those are just boundaries that protect our physical body. There's boundaries that protect our mind. Perhaps it's the music that we listen to. If we listen to certain music and it brings us down or it puts us in a strange mood, then we know to set a boundary around that. Perhaps if we're consuming too much content on the internet and it's draining us, we also have to set a boundary with that as well. And honestly, the boundaries we set with ourselves can be some of the hardest boundaries we have to set because there's no one that's checking us. It's something that we can get away with avoiding for a very long time. But ultimately, it catches up to us and it takes a toll on us physically, mentally, emotionally. And not only that, when we do avoid setting these boundaries with ourselves, it ends up trickling into loosening our boundaries in our relationships with other people, because the relationships that we attract in our life are always a reflection of our relationship with ourselves, which is something that I really didn't notice until a few years ago. If we are noticing that we have quite a few relationships where it's hard for us to set boundaries, that means that when it comes to our relationship with ourselves, we are also having a hard time setting certain boundaries. And if we start putting in the work and we start setting boundaries with ourselves, we'll notice that it's becoming a little bit easier to set boundaries in those relationships where we used to not really have any limits, and vice versa. If we start setting limits in relationships with other people and we protect the boundaries that we set with them, we'll notice that it will be easier for us to start setting boundaries with ourselves. So really consider that. Assess your life. Break it down, physical, mental, emotional, and try to pinpoint the areas where your boundaries are lacking in your relationship with yourself, and start drawing some lines out of love for yourself and your overall well-being. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope it gave you some tips on how to really start setting boundaries in your life, especially in those more challenging relationships and also in your relationship with yourself. If you enjoyed this topic, please rate this podcast, leave a comment, and share this with a friend or family member or anyone that you think might benefit from this episode. I hope you have an amazing week. I love you all. Until next episode, bye for now.